I'm very happy and honored to introduce you our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Alima. Indeed, you all know him from his books. He is a prolific researcher and writer who has had a great contribution to the studies on the human and social dimension of urban design, particularly. Alima, who is an architect, has a master's degree in architecture and a PhD in town planning. He's currently professor of urban design at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape in Newcastle University in the UK. He's a founding member on the Global Urban Research Unit at the same university. He has been conducting researches focusing on the topics of social exclusion and urban neighborhoods in particular. Among the books that he published, Design of Urban Space in 1996, Public and Private Spaces of the City in 2003, Social Exclusion in European Cities in 2003 again, Urban Design, Space and Society in 2014, and most recently, the Handbook of Planning Theory in 2018, have been widely read by researchers and practitioners worldwide. Dear Professor Madanipur, dear Ali, thank you very much for kindly accepting our invitation. The title of his speech today is Placing and Distancing, a Critique of Neighborhood Planning and Design. The platform is yours. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you for the introduction and many thanks for the kind invitation. My aim here in this presentation is to examine the idea of neighborhood as a distinctive entity, as it is widely used in planning and design. I use two concepts of placing and distancing as a critical perspective into the ideas and practices of this distinctive neighborhood development. Can I check with you if my sound is okay?
It is okay here in the hall. Is it okay in the YouTube? Yeah, it is.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with the example of a housing development in this city of Newcastle upon Tyne, in the northeast of England, where I am based. The area is called the Great Park, located on the northern edge of the city. Its development started in 2001. It was delayed by the economic crisis from 2008 onwards. And when it becomes eventually completed, it is planned to have 4,500 residential units split into a number of neighborhoods. In many ways, it is a typical British suburban housing development formed of two-story houses with gardens built by mass housing developers for middle-class households with a high level of car ownership, the type of development that has been going on for decades. This development has been promoted as a sustainable development and a thriving community made of a number of distinctive neighborhoods. As you see from their website, it is claimed that Newcastle Great Park isn't a collection of buildings. It is a collection of homes, businesses, and people who come together to live, work, learn, collaborate, and smile. But behind this facade, this is a suburban development with all the problems that have been associated with such areas, lacking the basic social infrastructure. So for most people, any need, you have to travel by car. This is the website of an action group made of some local residents. As you see, they say we are 700 residents of this area. They call the Great Park the great betrayal. Their complaint is that the claims made by the consortium of house builders who have managed the process of development have not been met. And so they warn the potential buyers to stay away, as you see in the slide below. This shows a well-known gap between rhetoric and reality, between the claims that are made in the development process and what has been actually achieved and delivered in practice. It shows a temporal and economic gap between the buildings and infrastructure, between what can be sold for profit and what is necessary but not financially rewarding. The first is speeded up and the second is delayed. Despite these problems, this is a rather expensive area, residential area. So the rationale behind selecting this area inside the city's green belt, its design and promotion, is to appeal to a middle-class market. In particular, the two techniques of planning and design in urban development, and more broadly as techniques of social organization that I want to emphasize in this talk, are placing and distancing. This area is placed on the northern edge of the city, next to other middle-class areas. It generates a safe distance from the city with all its social and environmental problems. Placing and distancing becomes the operating mechanism of land and property market and the formation and maintenance of a social geography. These two techniques are key tools for social organization, which are deployed in both public policy and market operations. Placing envisages social groups as distinctive categories, allocates them a place in the social hierarchy, and consolidates this hierarchy through spatial organization, where each group has a place in the social order and the urban landscape. Distancing keeps these groups apart, maintains their distinctions, and consolidates the social arrangement in the form of a permanent or semi-permanent spatial pattern. Around the same time that the Great Park starts to be built, another major program of urban development starts in this city, which is branded Going for Growth. In the picture you see the city's mayor with the late star architect Richard Rogers, who was employed to redesign the city and plan for its future. According to this plan, the city was envisaged as a series of distinctive neighborhoods. Thousands of houses were going to be demolished and many more to be built. What this plan was doing was shaking the order of placing and distancing that had been operating in the city for generations. But this order was no longer functional, as the processes of deindustrialization had changed the economic foundations of the city and hollowed out the working class neighborhoods. This was a plan of displacing and replacing. Of course, this process of placing and displacing, which reflects the structural changes in the economy, has not been new in the city. It had been at work during the large-scale modernist redevelopments after the Second World War, when many old working-class areas were branded as slums and were developed with serious social consequences. At the time of the policy of Going for Growth, 20 years ago, however, people in these Newcastle neighborhoods could not accept such wholesale displacement. Protests and campaigns successfully defeated the plan, and Richard Rogers was dismissed by the city. In its place, it initiated several community participation programs to engage people in their new, more modest plans. These two examples from Newcastle, a suburban scheme and an inner city plan for renewal, show the complexity of urban development and how there are always economic, political, and cultural issues involved. So I follow some of these threads to find out more about the idea of distinctive neighborhoods and the concepts of placing and distancing. Richard Rogers had been working as the head of a task force to develop strategies for an urban renaissance in British cities. Their report that was published in 1999 put forward a series of recommendations for urban development to bring people and life back to the city. It envisaged cities as a neat system of neighborhoods. Each neighborhood was supposed to have a clear center and a series of necessary ingredients. You can find this report online and you can download it and see it. It was a landmark document for its time. The idea of the neighborhood as a distinctive place with a clear center, clear edges, and a mix of activities is also a theme of new urbanism, which had become a widespread idea in the United States from the 1980s onwards. This echoes the British new towns, like Washington near us here in Newcastle, designed in the 1960s, which was a series of so-called villages around the transportation network. The two generations of British new towns in the second half of the 20th century were mostly designed on the basis of this idea of distinctive neighborhoods, clearly separated from each other by some distance to give the impression that each neighborhood is a world on its own. The idea is also there in Kevin Lynch's image of the city and his 5 elements of reading and designing the city, where he's advocating distinctive districts and clear edges. What he is looking for is order, clarity, and distinction, trying to overcome the actual ambiguity and overlaps that are hallmarks of large cities. This partly itself goes back to the idea of neighborhood units, which had become the design orthodoxy in the mid-20th century. The idea was generating identifiable entities in the middle of a large and growing metropolis. Neighborhood units were envisaged as a mechanism for social cohesion, focused on a school in the middle of an area, which could also be used as a community center. This practice of placing was accompanied by the practices of distancing, which were developed by land use planning. Around the turn of the 20th century, mass migration to the United States had created fears of the incoming strangers in large numbers to cities like New York. Excuse me. So the solution was devising a planning system that would classify people and activities into distinctive categories, allocate specific places to these categories, and ensure to keep them apart what was thought to be incompatible. The idea also goes back to the British garden cities more than a century ago, which was also a response to the growth of the metropolis. But this time, it was an attempt to combine the city and the countryside, somehow trying to give shape and order to the process of suburbanization that had already started in British cities in the second half of the 19th century. what the Garden City movement wanted to create was an alternative to the city in the form of a small town made of small neighborhoods, a form of micro-urbanism that would change the scale of the city from a metropolis to a village or a small town made itself of identifiable neighborhoods. The context of this desire for distinction is the 19th century twin processes of industrialization and urbanization, which created large cities full of people who were uprooted from their towns and villages and had gathered in cities living in miserable conditions and without much connection with each other. Ferdinand Tönnies was one of those analysts who distinguished between community and society. The old bonds of community and kin were broken, and the new bonds were at best functional and contractual. So a major topic of concern becomes the alienation of the crowds, the disconnection of people from their cultural roots and from each other, and the social problems of isolation and lack of cohesion, which have remained to this day. The challenge becomes how to address this problem. One of the legacies of the 19th century in European cities are the institutions such as churches, clubs, and unions, as well as spaces like public parks, which were set up to confront this social fragmentation and for the creation of new social bonds. One of the main solutions offered by planners and designers has been reorganizing the city in the image of a series of villages. The Romantic tradition of the 18th and 19th centuries nostalgically looked to the past, to the apparently peaceful life in rural areas as an ideal. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideal community is a village where everyone does everything, and there is no division of labor. It is imagined as a fully integrated life in complete contrast to the fragmented modern urban. This ideal of life in a village is still with us today. The majority of populations in the English-speaking countries still prefer to live in a village rather than a city, which is why suburbanization has continued with force. Garden cities, new towns, and new urbanism, as well as urban villages, are trying to keep this dream alive. And it is this idealized image of life in the city as if living in a village that is evoked by the idea of planning and designing neighborhoods. The idea that you can live an integrated life close to nature, even if you are in the middle of a world of high mobility, rapid change, social fragmentation, and alienation. This is, of course, often limited to an image, unable to change the reality of living in a metropolis. Much has been said about the warmth of place and the coldness and abstraction of space. The distinctive neighborhood is expected to offer a place with an identity, escaping from the alienation of space. A large urban area is usually a collection of clusters. For example, a map of London will show a cluster of government buildings, a cluster of places of entertainment, a cluster of educational institutions, a cluster of offices, a cluster of financial institutions, and so on. It will also show clusters of social and cultural groups, where higher and low income groups and specific ethnicities are clustered. At the more detailed level, clusters of basic necessities have taken the form of high streets at the heart of city districts. The formation of these clusters is a historical process with many decisions by individuals and organizations, as well as structures of government regulations and market mechanisms at work to generate this order of clusters. It is a process of placing in which different functions and groups find spatial expression. In spatial economics, there has been long-standing interest in the reasons why competing businesses, for example, try to locate near each other, Alfred Marshall famously. In the Middle Eastern bazaars, this is clearly visible, where clusters of similar trades have created specific wings of the market, such as jewelers in one street, spice traders is another, and so on. So this process of clustering is not new. So we can read cities through their clusters of functions, social hierarchy, and cultural diversity. They are different systems of distinction that find spatial expression, and once established, reproduce themselves. It is important to note that these are not natural processes, as some people have suggested. The Chicago School even used expressions from natural sciences to describe the emergence of social clusters, as if we are witnessing ecological processes at work. But the emergence of clusters are social and historical, rooted in particular circumstances and contexts. While individuals, households, and organizations may have a degree of choice in their location, they are operating within a context that provides opportunities and sets limitations. These limitations are highest when you are at the lowest ranks of social hierarchy, so you are more likely to be placed, being given a tight spot in the social and spatial arrangements. But if you are at the top of the hierarchy, your circle of freedom to choose is much larger, much wider. The practices of urban governance and urban design and planning tend to treat the existing clusters as given and try to work with this grain. In this map of Berlin, the city is divided into what they call living areas, Lebenswelt. It's space oriented towards Lebenswelt, which are identified on the basis of a series of socioeconomic features of each of those areas. It is a move away from the past when the city was subdivided on the basis of its physical structure of roads. It shows more sensitivity towards social differences within the city, so that the necessary response can be made to people's needs. It identifies the socioeconomic clusters and uses them as a tool of city administration. The idea of distinctive neighborhoods becomes an urban management consideration. There is a transition from the emergence of clusters to recognizing them and to using them as an instrument. This instrument of urban management is popular for the authoritarian systems of population control. In what has probably been the largest wave of urban development in human history, Chinese residential areas in the past 40 years have been predominantly developed as gated compounds. This draws on the history of Imperial China, on the communist era's integration of working and living space, on the structure of housing production by large companies, and on the fear of people from large waves of incoming strangers, immigrants who came from rural areas and small towns. Although recently this approach has been officially abandoned and gated compounds are to be opened up for easing urban mobility, but still the majority of housing areas are gated compounds. Neighborhoods are also a tool of production. The structure of housing market in the UK is dominated by a few large developers. But these speculative developers, infill and single developments are not very profitable. Their pattern of work is to buy large parcels of land, borrow from the banks at low rates of interest, mobilize their sizable productive capacity, and develop large-scale residential areas. As the case of Great Park exemplified, these operations are primarily driven by profit, and a captive market is not able to make substantial demands on the quality of the product. Economies of scale is an important part of their production of space. To sell it, however, they need to promote it as a community, as a place, as a desirable, prestigious destination. The term village is frequently used just to imply that desire for rural living among the population is responded to. As we saw in Newcastle's Great Park, these developers say we don't produce buildings, we produce homes and communities. They claim to make place which has positive associations. Of course, the idea of village does not have the same connotations in various parts of the world. In many countries, a village is a place of disadvantage and poverty, where agriculture is not rewarding and climate change is a threat for earning a living. The rural village is a place to escape from. The urban village also has a negative image, as you see in China, in Beijing, where the urban village is a place of disadvantage, the place of ghost workers, unregistered and without access to services, where they can live in the middle of the city, but on the margins of society. Placemaking has become the honorary title for a wide range of professionals' activities. In the dichotomy of place and space, place is subjective, meaningful, and made by people who inhabit a space, making it their own over time. So how can built environment professionals claim to make places, while making places can only be done by those who inhabit a place in the future, not by those who make it? Most places that are built through speculative development, there's no one involved in the process. So placemaking claims to involve people in the process, but most of the developments in the UK are done speculatively without the knowledge of who is there. If most housing developments, houses are built for anonymous future buyers who have yet to be found, how can placemaking work? Placemaking, like building communities or villages, ends up being terms of promotion and branding. At best, they indicate an attempt to think holistically about a development, but at worst, they are just branding exercises. This is a map of London produced for identifying localities. It is somewhat similar to the Berlin map that I showed earlier, but not a systematic map produced by the municipality. It feeds into a trend of localism that has been going on in the UK for a few years. For the past 11 years, a policy of neighborhood planning has been at work in the UK. This is introduced as an initiative that gives local populations the powers to define the boundaries of their neighborhood and plan its future. It appears as a bottom-up empowering tool to help people decide for their future. However, as it was introduced by a conservative government in favor of deregulation, and after a period of austerity after the economic crash, it is viewed by many with suspicion. Moreover, it needs local capacities to mobilize and produce a plan, which is beyond the scope and ability of many low-income areas. Neighborhood plans are not allowed to say what they don't want. Many middle-class areas don't want new housing in their area because they want to keep the quality as it is. But they're not allowed to say that in their plans. A plan is expected to say what people want for their area. But this needs investment, which comes from the private sector investors who are interested in areas that have good returns on their investment. So there are development pressures in desirable areas where investment money is available and where better off people live. But they fight off this pressure because they don't want new housing development that increases the density, traffic, and noise in their area. So this cannot be done through neighborhood plans. In less affluent areas, there's no appetite for investment, and no amount of neighborhood planning can persuade the private investors to invest in such areas. This is why the uptake of neighborhood planning has not been very high. When investors become interested in less affluent areas, they become the agents of displacement and gentrification. The area becomes attractive due to its location. Existing inhabitants are displaced by higher rents or forced out through redevelopment schemes. The process of placing that through market price mechanism, public policy, and social relations had produced a social geography is now being shaken. The economic foundations of that social geography has been radically changed. The status, role, and strength of low-income workers have dwindled, and they are seen as being unduly residing on expensive land and property. While the mid-20th century had reorganized the built environment to accommodate the needs and demands of industrial workers, now the disorganized, internationalized, and poorly paid workers in the service sector are not considered as a threat, and thereby they are displaced from desirable locations and placed in more marginal locations and conditions. These structural economic changes have led to an increase in social inequality, as acknowledged by various organizations and analysts. Here I'm showing 3 reports by the EU, the OECD, and the UK government, all saying how social inequality has risen in the previous 3 decades. That is marked by the decline of the welfare state and the emergence of neoliberalism. With the rising tide of social inequality, the practices of placing and displacing are supported by the reinvigorated practices of distancing, removing the disadvantaged populations to farther distances on the periphery, or erecting barriers that would keep them apart. The historical example of distancing has been suburbanizing in some countries, leaving poor cities, inner cities, and peripheralization in others, creating low-income banlieue. When social inequality grows, distancing becomes more needed by the wealthy, and the barriers also grow, as in this South African gated neighborhood. When the 2 sides of social inequality are forced to live next to each other, distancing finds harsher expressions, as is this case in Dublin. And the barriers can be harsher still, as here in Los Angeles, where the threat of violence is used for distancing. Now, I realize I'm near the end of my time, and I'm just showing some examples from this example from Milan. Excuse me. This is a wealthy neighborhood in Milan, designed by the famous architect Zaha Hadid. It's beautiful development. What I want to show is how it is separated from, it's a neighborhood that is separated from the rest of the area by significant walls. And what comes really important symbol of this separation is this gateway, which makes this place like a fortress. Now, if you look to the other side of the road, the same road, you see this development, which is a banal, perhaps 1960s development, not very architecturally significant, but very welcoming. You can see inside, you can have some sort of interaction visually, and it's not detached like this one. It is part of the cityscape. And if you go back further, one generation in the same area in Milan, these are developments that are much more welcoming, providing public spaces to the surrounding areas. So they are not fortresses, they are parts and making good contribution to the area that they are located in. And of course, this is the ultimate situation in placing and distance. This is unplacing, where the growth of homelessness in rich cities shows that the practices of placing and distancing have completely failed, and leaving some people placeless and distance-less. They are close and everywhere, nomadically fleeting and disobeying the rules that the social and spatial order that is running the city. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agi. Now, I'm sure there will be questions, and I hope there will also be a discussion. We can take some questions from the hall or from the from the YouTube, if we have any. Okay. Yeah, maybe you have some questions. Maybe I can start. Indeed, the issue of neighborhood itself, it is an old concept, isn't it? That existed from the very beginning of towns, indeed. They are social entities, but also administrative entities, and so on. This is what we call in Turkish mahalle. In different, Middle Eastern societies, the same notion is used. Yet at the same time, a neighborhood unit, indeed, is a different notion, which was used as a tool of planning, especially during the 20th century. Louis Mumford, I think, was a very, he was militating, he was defending this idea for social cohesion, mainly. And still today, of course, as our cities keep growing, and as the urban population has become really, more than 50% of the world population is living today in cities. Neighborhood idea could be also a tool for a democratic society. I would like to ask you this issue. Indeed, a neighborhood can be a democratic unit as well. But as far as we can see from your talk, that it is used for distinction, for segregation, for policies of segregation by municipalities or governments, and so on. Isn't there any possibility to still use this idea also for providing social services, common spaces? Professor Stavridis is with us. Collective spaces and so on. I think you are quite critical against this notion. Can you explain further? Can it be used as a tool for local democracy or not?
Yes, absolutely, it can be. The local democracy is based on people getting together and organizing themselves into and doing what, mobilizing their resources, their energies. And if a neighborhood framework can help that's fine. There's no problem with the idea of neighborhood. The problem I'm raising is this mechanical top-down idea of organizing the city on that basis, as if this leads to some sort of democratic arrangement. But it's what you are suggesting is the bottom-up or the people mobilizing, and that takes shape now, not necessarily through physical proximity in the form of a neighborhood, but also in all sorts of other forms of civil society organization that can be crossing different long distances. People can get together. Local democracy. So it's not necessarily in the same mahalla, in the same neighborhood, that it gets shaped. It's an older version where people were bound to local this, and therefore their issues were entirely local. But now the high mobility and high connectivity across a large city is such that you really cannot only rely on neighborhood as a basis of local democracy. Of course, there are local issues like local services, things that bring people together, but it's just one set of issues that a big complex society has. So if we reduce the operations of society and local democracy to the neighborhood issues, we miss something. If we decide from the top that we split the city into manageable neighborhoods and keep their distinctions, that can be a little bit, that is used in a mechanical way. That's far from any democratic consideration. It's a managerial, instrumental way of thinking about it. But of course, if it emerges from people's needs and connectivities, and if there's no necessity to think of a feudal tribal system of this neighborhood is very distinctive from the next, it's not football teams fighting each other, or if you go back to historical cities where people lived in the same neighborhoods for a long time, famous examples, the story of Romeo and Juliet, where they were coming from warring neighborhoods. So the neighborhood was so rigid and consolidated in particular locations. And they then developed this sort of fight against each other because their identities are so rooted in particularities and becomes very tribal. That sort of tribalism is not welcome in a democratic society. That's the problem.
Yeah. And these neighborhoods become, they are formed of gated communities more and more. Yeah. There is a tendency towards the formation of gated communities, which is really a problem.
And especially in the context of the growing social inequality, which makes it very difficult for thinking of these local energies being able to get together, where the examples that I showed was showing how these distinctions are creating barriers and distances rather than integrating people or creating more cohesion.
Could the project of Richard Rogers be applied, implemented?
Sorry, say it again.
Richard Rogers' project, could it be implemented?
Well, the problem with those projects was massive demolition. Demolitions where really people were living in these homes. It was, people were just mobilized themselves. That was part of local democracy, fighting the idea of imposing on them new neighborhoods. They wanted to live in their existing neighborhoods. They didn't want to lose their homes, even if the quality of homes and the buildings were not so good, but they were happy with where they were. They didn't want 6,000 buildings being demolished. And the same thing happened in other cities in the UK, in Liverpool, the same, that they were very good quality buildings planned to demolish because there was no demand for it and they wanted to build new things. And it's still going on. So there is this approach of kind of construction industry solution to social problems.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have a question. Burak Büyükcirelek from City Planning Department. Maybe you will tell me your question. Yeah, in any case, I have to repeat from here, it seems.
Thank you very much for this very concise and informative presentation. I have two questions, although you showed the sign for further discussion on these two topics. So I would like to benefit from this opportunity to further discuss with you these issues. One of them is about the social production of space and space politics that you mentioned in the presentation. I would like to ask, to what extent can we distance ourselves to general political economic conditions in the production of space, whether it goes to segregation or other characters that give the space? And the second issue is about the democracy issue. It can be linked partially with the political economic context, partially with the cultural context that may change in the course of time. But sometimes communities purposefully would like to distance themselves from the rest of the society. And from a top-down point of view, despite this demand, if they would like to integrate themselves, would it be an anti-democratic practice?
Yeah, should I repeat?
Yes, please. I couldn't get it, sorry.
Yeah, maybe it's better if you come here. That is the best. While doing so, he asked two questions. One, the first one is about the social production of space and social politics. Indeed, I mean, he would like you to comment on these issues from the perspective of social production of space. And the second one, you can come, is about democracy. If communities indeed have that tendency to distance themselves, isn't it to force them to segregate?
Yes, so you want us to resume to my demands. Yes, just for the first one, I would like to say, to what extent can we distance ourselves from the general political economic conditions when we talk about production of space and politics of space? In your presentation, it was almost like the space is producing by itself and sometimes by the direct effect of designers like Rogers's project, etc. But to my point of view, it's the political economic conditions that define the production of space more than the individuals. I would like your further comments on this. And for the second issue is about sometimes communities would like to exclude themselves purposefully from the rest of the society. And from a top-down point of view, if they try to integrate themselves despite this demand, wouldn't be an anti-democratic practice. What you would like to say about this? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Well, obviously I didn't mean to say that spaces build themselves. That would be wrong to make that claim. That it's obvious spaces are made by people, and people live in conditions. Well, I think all of us trying to say was how space, approach to space, the concepts that people use. People make spaces. Spaces don't make themselves. People make spaces. And those people are obviously located in all sorts of conditions, political, economic, cultural. So social production of space is a structural analysis to say there are social organizations, social structures, and social structures are very much at work when spaces are made. And I think all I was trying to say was that, yes, I was trying to show how spaces are made by social processes, and social organization is reflected in spaces, not to say that spaces make themselves. The other point about when communities separate themselves, that's a very big challenge these days. If you think about democratic arrangements for society, people should be able to live their lives the way they want. But of course, if they are part of a society, they should also play with the rules of that society. So the idea is not to create secluded and sealed enclaves for anyone. Everyone should be subject to the rule of law and the politics of the country that is democratically agreed. And that applies to minorities as well as to the rich enclaves.
I think that necessitates some social policies. The governments should be sensible enough. Is there another question? Is there any other question? Maybe Professor Stavridis. May I ask you to come here, or should I? Yeah, come.
First of all, thank you for this insightful presentation, Professor Madenpour. Actually, I have two questions related to the issue of what you have mentioned as a duality between placing and distancing. So the first one is how we can assess the role of the architect in maintaining or balancing a moderate balance relationship between both placing and distancing. And the second question is related to the difference in the scale and the implementation, or the time run for the processes of planning and designing or practice, let's say. So how we can sustain a transition smooth architecturally, starting from the planning process, moving towards the practical implications for such sustainable relationship, let's say, between these placing and displacing duality. Thank you.
Thank you. So obviously the role of the practitioners is, as I said, a lot of the time, practitioners, policymakers, as well as practitioners in the built environment, take the existing structure of clustering in the city for granted. They don't see their role as changing that. And of course, it is tough to expect them to change that. It is so deeply rooted in the city, in the organization of space, that it's not easy for anyone, individual discipline, or even decision makers to change that in the short term. And when they want to do that, they go through this process of displacing that I was talking about. So it's, but at the same time, the question becomes the role of professionals within existing systems of politics, economics, and cultural order. So how do you see yourself? Do you say, I am given this task and I'll do it. If I don't do it, somebody else will do it. Or do you see yourself as a citizen also, that you have a role to play? And that becomes a complicated role. But if you expect an individual to change things dramatically, it becomes autocratic even. So you have to work with the grain and see how you can make improvements and change directions if you can suggest it. The relationship between planners and designers and the implementation of these, placing and distancing are key concepts of design and planning. When you are organizing something, you use these concepts. It's just part of the vocabulary. If you don't think about it, you do it. And that's what I was trying to suggest, was that this is not just limited to designers and planners, but it is a practice of society to do that, to place and to distance through a system of distinctions, which then finds spatial manifestation.
But there are agents which direct that system. Professor Stavridis, maybe if you can, that would be great. This is some problems of hybrid conferences.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's really important to see the myth of neighborhood as a liberating place or as a place of social cohesion, somehow unveiled and discussed. I wonder, in your approach, what is the meaning of reclaiming the center? Is it a kind of alternative strategy from the poor or from the displaced to not simply adjust themselves in the place they are assigned to, but actively reclaim the city as a totality, reclaim the center, and thus, perhaps as you suggest, meet each other, find new relations, create relations from afar, not only through connectivity, but with real presence. Would you consider acts or struggles to reclaim the center as part of this strategy?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, of course, when people show their actions in all sorts of forms, and these reclamations, these appropriations are signs of mobility and signs of mobilization of populations demanding change. But to see them as only, because sometimes they are aesthetic gestures, or at least seen by others as aesthetic gestures, or as disorganized activities, and they praise it as disorganized activities. And disorganized gestures often don't lead to any substantive change directly. So what happens is that, of course, these activities of opening up spaces, taking over spaces, protests, or community organizations coming out and wanting to change, all sorts of forms of activity are significant and they should be taken seriously. But at the same time, there is a problem with aesthetic gestures that a lot of people in architectural planning and some disciplines like that, they think they've achieved something, but that gesture of taking over a space and for a short while, but it is just a short while event. And it may not lead to any substantive change over time. We need to find ways of turning that energy into something sustainable and long-term.
Thank you very much, Professor Madanikou, really for your mind-opening speech and for this discussion. Thank you for your contribution to our conference.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you very much to you and all the audience and the people who were present. Thank you very much. It was very lovely. And I'm very sorry that I'm not there with you so that we can continue the discussions.
Thanks a lot. Next time we would like to see you with us. Bye-bye.